This lecture is on Isaiah Berlin and the topic freedom. What is freedom? What are some different things that people might mean when they talk about the word freedom? Well, freedom can be used in a political sense when talking about when other people do things to interfere with you. There are also non-political uses of the word, when interferences are from nature or from oneself. For example, when the rock slide interferes with your freedom to use the road, that would be a non-political sense in which your freedom has been restricted. Or if your anger makes you unable to control yourself, we say that a person can become slave to their passions. They are unfree in the sense that they are unable to control their actions. But again, typically we call this a non-political use of the word freedom. There are also some less obvious non-political uses. Some of you may have heard of the free will problem or the free will versus determinism problem. This is the degree to which one's mind is in fact one's own rather than the product of unknown physical forces. There's also the idea of freedom of self-realization, and this is the expansion of one's horizons through the acquisition of knowledge, especially acquiring the means to acquire knowledge. So learning a new language makes you freer. Learning mathematics makes you freer because of your enhanced understanding of the world. Learning the scientific method makes you freer, again, because of your increased abilities that you acquire. So knowledge will set you free. Now, the fact that a kind of freedom is non-political in the sense that I just described does not mean that one shouldn't necessarily use politics to secure that sort of freedom. All it means is that the primary source of a disability is not the actions of others, including government. Why might we care about this sort of distinction? Well, perhaps we want to think about the times when we're wronged, times when other people do not give us our due. And of course, this is going to set the table for things like punishment and compensation. So we want to talk about having one's political freedom restricted. Really what we're talking about is the conditions under which other people might be punished for interfering with us. We don't want to punish the landslide, or generally speaking, we don't necessarily hold the government responsible when natural accidents befall us, and so we don't say that it's therefore an injustice. On the other hand, when people do things to interfere with us, we start thinking that it might be an injustice and it might require some sort of legal remedy. It's also the case that talking about freedom in this sort of way gives us a better handle on what it is that needs to be justified, that is to say, other regarding behavior. Now, if impositions on our liberty are the only type of wrong that can be done to us, then that would just exhaust the topic of political philosophy. But that's probably too easy. But even if it doesn't exhaust the topic, it does help narrow our focus on rights and on duties as being the sorts of things that need to be justified. That is to say, what needs to be justified is when other people interfere with us. When talking about political freedom, we often follow Isaiah Berlin and talk about positive versus negative freedom. This doesn't mean freedom that's bad and freedom that's good. It means something a little bit more technical. Negative freedom, also known as negative liberty, means freedom from external interference by other men. And here, men is used in a gender-neutral sort of way. So, being free from censorship, right? Other people are not stopping you from talking or threatening you if you talk. Freedom from being robbed, again, other people are not taking your stuff, are not interfering with your use of your stuff. These seem like paradigmatic cases of negative liberty. Positive freedom, also known as positive liberty, is the freedom to be in control of myself and of my life. So it's the answer to the question, who is in control, not what interferences or roadblocks are in my way. So, for example, the power to purchase a car. If I'm able to purchase a car, if I'm negatively free to purchase the car, it means that no one is stopping me. If I have positive freedom to purchase a car, then it means that I actually have the resources and the capabilities necessary to purchase a car. or the power to control outward displays of my emotions. Again, this is a kind of positive liberty. Now, it is still a political form of freedom to the degree that we're trying to decide who is in control, the individual or someone else, right? Who is in control of my actions? Who determines what I do? If someone has a gun to my head, I think it's pretty plausible to say that not only am I being interfered with, but somebody else has acquired control over my actions. Anything I do is no longer really the product of my will, but it sounds like it's the product of the will of someone else because of this particular threat. And that's what makes threats such problematic things in political philosophy, and why it's often the case that people think that threats are very bad. All right, so what's the difference between positive and negative liberty at the end of the day? Well, negative freedom doesn't guarantee that I have the power to do very much, right? Negative freedom doesn't say that I have a lot of options. It merely says that other people will not interfere with me. So, in the sense that a handicapped person is free to, I don't know, is free to play basketball. But again, the question is not being able to run and jump like able-bodied persons. Perhaps the disabled person is also in some sense not free to play basketball, does not have the power to do so, even if nobody interferes with his or her exercise. Positive freedom, on the other hand, requires that you be able to control yourself, so that you have full control over your limbs, and it is you that is in control. It has a lot more to do with power. And of course, positive freedom and gaining positive freedom may require interference in your life and in the life of others in order to give you more control. In particular, it might require resources, but it might not just require resources. Giving a handicapped person more money is not going to enable them to play basketball. On the other hand, giving them a wheelchair may just enable them to get on the court to play wheelchair basketball. And of course, giving them access to rehabilitation facilities, surgery, and good health care might eventually get them walking and even playing basketball again. So once again, what is required here is to give people control, whether it be over their limbs, over their eyesight, over their actions, and that sort of control requires resources, and those resources may have to come from interferences in other people's liberty, negative liberty. Okay, so what are the political implications? Well, in both cases, protecting positive and negative freedom requires government intervention and performance. For instance, negative liberty and preserving negative liberty requires that government be capable of controlling itself, so that government keeps control over its own agents such that they don't interfere with you. And of course, it requires the government also be able to control other individuals who want to interfere with you in various ways. And so it requires a fair amount. It allows the government still to do a fair amount. It's actually a misconception to think that negative liberty is a sort of small government view, because it all really depends on how much people are inclined to interfere with your liberty. If people are actually quite inclined to interfere with your liberty, then the government is going to have to do quite a bit and collect a lot of resources to defend negative liberty on top of that. Promoting positive liberty, however, requires that people be assisted in taking more control over their lives, people who are disabled in some way. And I'm not just talking about the physically disabled, but also those who are poor or those who lack self-control, that they be assisted in asserting more control over their lives. And that may require taking resources away from other people. It certainly may require stopping other people from exercising their liberty if such liberty would tend to decrease the control of the people who need to be enabled in some way. So Berlin's view sides pretty clearly on the side of negative liberty. His view is that conceptions other than negative freedom tend to be politically dangerous. Objecting to interference, he thinks, puts clear boundaries and mandates on what the government must and must not do. Whereas promoting control, he thinks, is more open to political abuse. It puts more tools in the hands of politicians and legislators, and such tools are liable to be abused once they are given away. So how is promoting positive freedom more open to abuse? Well, there's two real possibilities here, two dangerous possibilities that promoting individual control actually engenders. The first one is that interfering with some to prop up the capabilities of others is seductive. It's a seductive program to people in power because it licenses and encourages seizing power and exercising it, right? So it gives further justification for those who would like to have such justification to use power. And second, if the self is conceived of as kind of divided between a higher and a lower self, then restrictions not only on other people but on individuals themselves for their own sake become entirely plausible. That is to say that from the government's point of view, you may be liberated from yourself no matter what you say, no matter how much you don't necessarily want to be liberated. And for Berlin, that's exceptionally dangerous, right? These two licenses given to the government to interfere with individuals for the sake of reestablishing their control over their lives is perhaps the beginning of a slippery slope that leads to some pretty unpleasant places. Note that Berlin is not saying that positive freedom isn't important, and he's not saying that ideal governments populated by angels could not make helpful interventions in limiting negative freedom for the sake of more positive liberty. What he's saying is that granting such power to governments is dangerously trusting, given the histories of power abuses in the 20th century, which he lived through. He notes that communism and Nazism, the two great ideological tragedies of the 20th century, shared this faith in liberating people from themselves, if necessary, by giving more centralized power to these regimes. And both regimes campaigned ardently against bourgeois negative freedom as not being worth having and insufficient to truly emancipate, right? Truly liberate man's inner nature, whether that inner nature was conceived of as fundamentally egalitarian, as in the case of communism, that is to say, man's inner equality needed to be promoted, or whether it was man's racial nature and his national character that needed to be emancipated in the case of nationalist and racist fascism. A less controversial way of putting it is that a commitment to positive freedom, even if positive freedom is very valuable, involves a kind of political and moral gamble. You're gambling that the institutions you create to promote positive freedom can be controlled and channeled towards the right targets, and that the sacrifice of negative liberty, along with the gains in positive liberty, are worth this cost, are worth this gamble. Now, having seen the Holocaust and the Soviet gulags, Berlin is not anxious to gamble away negative freedom. He's not anxious to give more license to governments when they have shown that they use such licenses poorly in his own time. So if Berlin is right, then we have to choose between the risk of tyranny and the risk of politics failing to help us be better off. He thinks that politics are seductive because it promises us a better world if only we are willing to surrender our negative freedom. And he wants us to try to resist that seductive appeal. In effect, he's saying we need to make sure to avoid the worst abuses of unchecked government power, and that sometimes that means deciding not to pursue gains that seem within our grasp. And so at the end of the day, he leaves us feeling a bit pessimistic about the prospect for changing the world through decisive political intervention, because he says every time we license such interventions, we are in effect rolling the dice to and hoping that such licenses will not come back to haunt us later. There's no such thing, in other words, as giving away power only for good purposes. We can give away power, but then we have to hope and trust that they will be used for good purposes. Once we've lost power, in effect, we've abdicated. So, now maybe we don't want to be so pessimistic. And this is me talking, no longer Berlin. But perhaps there are some ways in which we can have our cake and eat it too. And I'm going to suggest two possible ways out of this gamble. Uh, One way to have more positive freedom without sacrificing negative freedom is to go the market route. If you believe market economists, then a decentralized system of market exchange where prices and economic decisions are mostly free from coercive interference, so negatively free, that sort of system tends to be good at producing economic prosperity over the long term. But if you think about it, economic prosperity is just another another word for more consumption possibilities. And that sounds like more control over our lives, more choices about where to live, how to live, and so on and so forth. Of course, markets may be seductive in their own way and work to reduce our self-control especially. But nonetheless, we might see our negative freedom not be sacrificed and our positive freedom enlarged through the enlargement of options about where to work, how to organize one's life, and what to consume and what lifestyles to pursue that are available in large liberal market economies and tend to not be available in small, either communist economies or pre-industrial economies. Another way out might be through democracy. So not through the market, but through democracy. Robust democracy with checks and balances may provide an answer to Berlin. Not all governments, perhaps, are doomed to descend into tyranny at any moment. By making sure that public decisions are submitted to the people for approval, we can help ensure that interferences with negative liberty are made up for by increases in positive liberty. And we do this by submitting the choice ultimately to the people. Of course, and here we can only speculate, but Berlin might have worried that democracies too can be seduced into giving up too many negative liberties in a vain search for more positive liberty, and then over time undermine their own freedom. Able politicians might well be able to use such quests for positive freedom as a means to exercise ever more power and thus even erode democratic controls over themselves. After all, Berlin might say, both Hitler and Mussolini came to power in democracies and then quickly turned them into non-democracies. So there you have it. Berlin's slight pessimism and some possible ways that we might think to still use politics to pursue positive freedom. Yeah, without sacrificing too much negative liberty.